Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Claypo from the South Central Center for Public Health Preparedness, and welcome to this preparedness broadcast. When a disaster strikes, there's an expectation that those in need will receive prompt and appropriate care. But as we've all seen, sometimes an event is so catastrophic that it overwhelms the capability of the response effort. Sometimes, despite the best planning and practice, a county or a state or a region simply needs help to respond. Now, following Hurricane Katrina, federal disaster declarations blanketed 90,000 square miles of the U.S., including 49 counties in Mississippi. And Mississippi was faced with the challenge of requesting and obtaining federal resources. Mississippi's experience can provide us with important insights into state and federal roles in disaster planning and response. And we are very fortunate today to have an expert panel that can help all of us understand how to navigate this sometimes very complicated path to utilizing government resources in a disaster. Now, we have a couple changes in our lineup this afternoon. Jim Craig was called away for a legislative session, and Chris Downing is assisting Secretary Leavitt this week. But we have a second A-team panel here today, and let me introduce you to them. Karen Cleveland, first of all, who is the Region 4 Emergency Coordinator at the Office of Public Health and Emergency Preparedness for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We've got Art Sharp, who is the Director of the Office of Emergency Planning and Response for the Mississippi Department of Public Health. And you all know him already. We have John Weibel, who's our Assistant Attorney General and General Counsel for the Alabama Department of Public Health. Karen, Art, and John are truly emergency management professionals, and they're here today to talk about things like the Stafford Act and the National Response Plan, but they're also here to answer your questions. And as you know, if you joined us last time, you have the opportunity today to have your questions answered live directly by this panel. Once we open this discussion, you get to drive it. So call or email your questions to the number and address that you see on the screen at any time during the broadcast. As soon as your questions come in, they'll be answered live as they're received. Our broadcast today is brought to you by the South Central Center for Public Health Preparedness in collaboration with the Alabama Department of Public Health. Funding for the center comes from the CDC. And if you'd like more information about the center, you can visit the webpage. And if you visit that webpage, be sure and check out the new Preparedness Minute. These are short video clips that will give you quick tips on emergency preparedness. You can also still register for the program and receive handouts and evaluation forms from the ADPH website. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. All right, so here's where I'm going to start. If you look at the Stafford Act or the Public Health Service Act and you read through it, it's clearly comprehensive. For me, it was completely overwhelming. And so my question to all of you, any of you, is can you start us off from the moment a disaster hits and sort of walk us through what happens from the moment it hits to the point of getting resources, and we'll kind of maybe use that as our launching point. And any or all of you can start.
I can tell you from my perspective, and I'm by no means an expert. I've been doing this job for quite a bit less than a year now. But I was the incident commander forward on the Gulf Coast for the Mississippi Department of Health. And I do understand a little bit about it. What happens is if there's an imminent threat, an imminent attack, an imminent public health threat, an imminent natural disaster, the governor of each state has the power and the authority to declare a state of emergency. And there's a fairly stylized process that goes through. The governor writes out an emergency declaration, someone on his staff does, and they put in things that are necessary for that particular emergency. For instance, the governor may wish to declare that the coast needs to be evacuated. That doesn't often happen, but it can in certain instances. Or perhaps there's been an earthquake and he declares a certain zone has to be evacuated. Well, those type things are put in the declaration, and he signs it and dates it, and it can be open-ended or closed. It can be have a date certain at the date the emergency will end, or it can be like the Katrina declarations that I think we're still under a state of emergency in Mississippi and probably in Louisiana for some time to come. But anyway, the governor suspends the certain acts and certain actions of state government agencies, empowers counties and cities to do certain things in the declaration, and it enables the government itself to then call on through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which you're going to talk about more later, and through federal partners to use the Stafford Act to get the needed assistance in, and that's the beginning of this cascade of help.
In that declaration, once he or she sends the declaration, can it then be amended or as time
Sure.
goes on? So this is not a...
It's not a static document. It's a living document.
Got it.
For instance, ours at one time ended, and then the governor extended it by signing another declaration, and that's been, I think, done several times, extending it for 30 days at a time. And he can vary the terms and conditions of that emergency order, if you will, or emergency declaration as time goes on. There may be certain things, for instance, the governor may declare martial law. That's not done. It wasn't done in Katrina. Mm-hmm. But if it were done, perhaps public order is restored in a few days, and the next emergency declaration doesn't say that we have martial law anymore. So it's a living document.
But then the declaration, though, I don't know, maybe John, the declaration is different than the request for resources, correct? So
Yes,
the declaration is sort of stating what's wrong and enabling then to move to the next step?
Well, let's make sure that we're going to be talking about really kind of two different streams that are attempting to get at the same purpose. The same purpose is to address the emergency situation with resources on the ground at the time of the emergency, and then to do whatever sort of remediation has to be done afterwards. But you've got the federal stream and you've got the state stream. Now, Art's been addressing the state stream, and I wanted to follow up on that a little bit more procedurally. In Alabama, it's under our Title 31 of our code, and this is an act that probably most states have something very similar to. It basically is a civil defense act.
Right.
States adopted these in the 1950s when we were all afraid that we were going to be, bombed, nuked, and so the statutes, most of the statutes have a little age on them, but they surprisingly set up a very good mechanism that puts the things into motion. In Alabama, we call it a proclamation. The governor proclaims a state of emergency, and usually when I think in terms of the word declaration, I think of the federal stream, the president declaring a Stafford Act emergency or one of the other federal declarations. But on the state side, when we have a state of emergency, and we've recently amended our law in Alabama to provide for an anticipatory emergency. Up until recently, Alabama's law really did not address the fact that the Weather Service could now predict a hurricane 5 days in advance. In the old days, you knew a hurricane was there when you saw the boards flying by. But now you can watch this thing when it comes off the Azores, and they are pretty much right. Our law has been amended to allow for an anticipatory proclamation. When the governor makes that proclamation, as Art said, lots of things go into effect. Laws are suspended, regulations are suspended. Things can happen such as reverse laning. The interstates, normally if you went in the wrong side of the road on the interstate, right. That's a violation of the law, but it's not now because the governor has extended that. But another thing that happens is that the state goes into its incident command structure. And this is ICS is something that we in public health have had to learn to understand what incident command system means, but it's not new to the emergency management people. They've been doing this for years and years and years. That's when we sort of circle the wagons. The agencies that we're going to talk a little bit later about, ESFs, emergency support functions. We're going to talk about that later, but the agencies that have certain functions that are emergency support functions all have liaisons that go up to our state emergency command center, which is at Clanton, Alabama, where the home of the EMA. And the governor goes up there too and starts directing things from a central command post. In public health, we have our own command post that's here in this building, and we follow the same ICS structure with the same position, nomenclature, and that sort of thing. To manage, the idea is to manage this disaster. It hits locally. Every disaster is local, but it doesn't stay local.
Right.
It immediately has shock waves.
Right.
So we are at the state level seeing what has to be done to address immediate needs, and then later on we start moving into that, coming into the remediation system.
And what he's describing is remarkably similar, almost identical to what Mississippi has. Its system works almost the same way that John's described, if not identically. And oddly enough, our Title 31 is our emergency management
Isn't that
code
interesting?
too. So
Is there great variation across states?
I think you probably see some variation. You probably see standardization occurring, though, as we move toward states being able to help each other, knowing what each other has, knowing the way that each other operates. And that's the incident command system that John's talking about and Karen is agreeing with. It's all driven by federal funding and the desire to work on a level playing field. Everybody knows what everybody else has. You can walk into his operations center, walk into our operations center, and find that probably the same positions exist. They're called the same thing, and they're operating, doing the same type functions. So that if John calls and tells me to come over and help him, I pretty much know what I'm going to be doing, and vice versa.
This process, though, you talked about the incident command structure. It doesn't necessarily get triggered, or it gets triggered by a proclamation of a disaster, but it doesn't have to, correct? Can the incident command structure, the circling the wagons, can that happen before the governor and his or team decide that this is going to be a declaration or not? Or is that sort of the trigger to...
You've got normal processes of county, city, municipal, and state government that are going to handle things except dealing with the emergent event. Okay,
until they're overwhelmed.
Yeah. So and realize that those normal channels. I mean, public service, the Alabama state troopers, the Mississippi state troopers, are going to be doing troopers business until somebody tells them to change. And the event, the emergency, is what drives that. We don't want to give in our system of constitutional government. I don't think we want to give somebody the power just to step outside and declare an emergency, or step outside before an emergency is declared and start doing things before the situation dictates. At the federal level, we have what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, which keeps the Army and the armed forces from doing things before an emergency is declared. We don't use the Army as a police force. And it's the same thing. We don't necessarily want to do a lot of things with state government before the emergency is declared.
But we can. I mean, that's what you talked about, the law changing, that if we see it's imminent and we're not overwhelmed yet, but we have a pretty good assessment that we're going to be overwhelmed, it can be declared prior to being overwhelmed.
Right. That puts the structure in place, and then you see how the event plays itself out. We obviously here on the Gulf Coast are subject to hurricanes, and they can come and they can be as devastating as the ones we have seen recently, or they can come, and we've had these in recent years that looked like it was going to be real bad. It's in the middle of the Gulf. It's a Category 4. It's a Category 3. It looks like it's going to hit as a Category 3, and then all of a sudden it hits the barrier islands, and it just kind of loses its force, and nothing. It doesn't do a lot of damage that we anticipated, in which case it's handled locally. When we're thinking about emergencies, I think the thing that those of us in public health, and really all responders, need to think about is emergency management. The local emergency management agency is the key player. Well, we're all key players, but they're the top dog, the coordinator for all the activities. Everything should go through the local EMA. They determine when they're overwhelmed, and that's when they need to call for assistance. And if they don't need to make that call, then they don't make that call. And that's the way it works within the state. And the state has resources basically to apply in the middle of the disaster. And of course, there are a lot of federal resources that can come too. Might you want to go ahead and talk about the Stafford Act?
Yeah, and that's exactly what my question is.
All right,
Okay, so the Stafford Act comes into play. What do we get? What do we get, or what do we have access to with the Stafford Act?
Well, the Stafford Act is the major federal act when you think of disasters and emergencies. Now, it's not the only one, but it's the major one, and it is the gatekeeper to invoking all sorts of a lot of other acts that may be funding sources or may be within the Public Health Service or Act or a lot of different things. But it allows basically federal funding administered by the Department of Homeland Security to prepare and provision for disasters. It allows there's probably some of that money in this conference that pays for training and these courses that we've all taken, the ICS courses and all that sort of stuff. That's Stafford Act money that pays for that. And there's not been a disaster. There's not been an emergency. That's ongoing. But it allows for the pre-placing of resources and personnel on an ongoing basis, but then also when it's anticipated, it allows for the resources to be moved to a staging area in anticipation of an emergency. And then it allows for federal resources to be requested in during the course of the disaster. And then that all takes place in a really short time frame, hours or very few days. Mm-hmm. Then we're left with what we have with Katrina and Rita, months and months into the years later now paying for this stuff. And the Stafford Act is very, very important in that too, in the paying, in how we get reimbursed. Follow the money trail. Really, under the Stafford Act, there are several different types of things that can happen under the Stafford Act. It is triggered by a declaration. Remember, I talked about the difference between a state proclamation of emergency and a declaration. Now, Mississippi, they may call it a declaration too, but the president declares a Stafford Act situation. He can declare certain levels. First, he can declare a major disaster, or he can declare an emergency, or 3 or 4 things that we don't see here, like fire suppression and defense emergency and that sort of thing. But mostly we're talking about either a major disaster or an emergency. And whether or not, this is triggered by the governor. The governor must request that this declaration be made except in certain circumstances. But the governor requests the declaration. And the way it works is it starts locally. There is a hurricane coming, and the people in one of the coastal counties, their EMA is overwhelmed. So they come to state EMA and they say, we're overwhelmed, we've got a huge disaster.
It's coming or it's hit?
Either way.
Either way, okay. We're going to be overwhelmed or we are overwhelmed.
Right.
Okay.
And so, in a major disaster, it has to hit.
Okay.
An emergency can be declared pre-disaster, but an emergency says that there is an emergency situation.
I see.
A disaster says that look out here and see. There's a mess. There's a disaster. When they request state EMA, who is in contact with the governor contacts through the regional FEMA office, through the state FEMA liaison, who directly contacts through FEMA to the White House, and the president then issues the declaration.
Okay.
There has to be a declaration for each state. The reason for that being, again, the words of the Stafford Act, except in certain circumstances, the declaration only comes when the governor requests the disaster. So if we got a wide-reaching hurricane, then there's got to be a disaster declaration for Mississippi and one for Louisiana and one for Alabama, and it's based on the need in that particular state.
Okay, let me just quick, tiny bit of tangent. You had talked about the Stafford Act's pretty broad reaching, and you had said that provides for a lot of different things, including, I think you were alluding to preparedness type. You said potentially this broadcast that we're having.
Right.
So where is that coming from? I mean, if it's triggered by a declaration, emergency declaration.
Well, not everything in the Stafford Act, that's what John was saying, not everything is triggered by either a declaration or a proclamation of emergency or a declaration or proclamation of disaster. The Stafford Act also allows the federal government to give assistance in anticipation of or in mitigation of certain events. So if you're going to have a hurricane, there are things going on the coast of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas right now that there's been no emergency declaration for an impending storm. But their efforts, their education, their strengthening of public buildings, their money for seawalls, perhaps, all these things can be tied in through the Stafford Act to federal. What John's pointing out, I guess, is that the Stafford Act is the umbrella act through which all federal aid for the mitigation of a disaster, prevention of an emergency event, or for when it actually happens, and the recovery from that event. That the Stafford Act kind of covers all of that,
right.
Not just part of it. It's the whole thing.
But the assets are request. I mean, whether it's for the mitigation or the flow of request is from the state up.
Yes.
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
And
it starts at the
even,
local level, and then bubbles up to the state, and eventually through EMAC or federal assistance.
Well, and I don't know if I'm going ahead of myself or not on my questions, but I'll let my curiosity take over. Okay. So walk us through a scenario. I mean, how does it? I mean, John's explaining the overarching concept, and it's making far more sense to me now than when I read it. But I'm sort of leaning to okay, something bad happens. Let's walk through a scenario, and I know there can be all kinds of scenarios, and maybe tell us some of the examples from Mississippi.
And again, keep in mind my involvement in the statewide effort was fairly local. So I had 6 counties on the Gulf Coast that worst hit, but the 6 counties on the Gulf Coast were mine. So a lot of the direct interaction between the state government at the level above me, the health department, senior level, the MEMA, the Mississippi Emergency Management level, to FEMA, or the State Department of Health level, to HHS. I was the beneficiary of it. I didn't necessarily see how it got done, but I'll tell you how I think it got done. You have a Hurricane Katrina that crosses over the tip of Florida and begins to curve and strengthen from tropical storm status that it got knocked down to into the Gulf. And there's a prediction, a probability, like John said, they're getting real accurate nowadays with that stuff, but there's a probability that it's going to hit the Gulf Coast. So, 4 or 5 days out, we know that there's a better than 50% chance it's going to hit us. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the governor does his proclamation or declaration of emergency.
Well, I'm going to stop you right there, though. But before he does that, at the local level, somebody is saying, I think this is going to be bad,
exactly right.
Yeah.
And then it's working its way up to the point where somebody informs the governor's team.
Step.
Okay, I'm trying to track with you.
Yeah, I unfortunately skipped that step. But if you think about it, the counties along the coast, they're just like Mobile, Baldwin County and Mobile County and the Mississippi Gulf Coast counties are very, very experienced in doing this. So they look and they see that this is just likely going to hit the Gulf Coast, and they start preparation efforts. And it looks like, they're going to need contraflow. Mm-hmm. They're going to need to evacuate 4 lanes instead of 2 lanes. they're going to need pre-positioning of assets. They're going to need things that the state and the federal governments have that they don't, like physicians, like law enforcement personnel, like the National Guard, like medical evacuation. All those things they don't have in great numbers in a county. They're in greater numbers in a state, and even much greater numbers in the federal domain. So they begin the process of looking, and they say we're going to need this stuff, and we need it now. And we've declared a local emergency, and we're going to evacuate everybody below Interstate 10, which is the interstate that goes across the Gulf Coast. So they request that of the state government. Can you help us? And in order to trigger the ability of the state to help, they have to declare an emergency. So you have this upward cascading effect as opposed to downward cascading effect. And maybe 96 hours out, there's certain things happen, and we start talking to the federal government. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services dispatches what used to be known as the CERT, and its name has changed. What is it, Karen, now? Incident
Response Coordination Team.
The IRT, Incident Response Coordination Team.
Yeah.
Well, the Secretary of Health and Human Services tells his emergency response team or incident response team, get to Mississippi, get to Louisiana, get to Alabama. He divides them up, however they divide up, and they start dispatching personnel. They're like a radio man in an Army platoon. Mm-hmm. They know what they need. They know that they need mortar and artillery support, and they're the people that figure out how do we get the support here, and how do we help you request it. Here's what we've got. Here's what we bring to the table. Now let's help you stage this in to the area. So those people actually come, and if there may be uniformed public health service personnel, they may be Centers for Disease Control personnel, they may be civilian senior personnel like Karen, but they come and they help these states sit there. They sit with you. They get up and do your 7 a.m. briefing. They do your 7 p.m. briefing when you do shift change. They have a night crew just like you do, and you integrate them into your operation.
Does this happen then? Does it happen automatically when the declaration is put forth? So the state declares either there's emergency, there's going to be, and then these folks from the federal level are dispatched, or does the state essentially need to ask to have them dispatched?
I don't know. Do you?
Yeah, the state needs to ask for an action request form, and hopefully sooner as opposed to later, it will morph into a mission assignment, and that's when the assets get turned on.
So, because we were talking before we started the show, that you had talked about, I don't remember how many people essentially came and were living with you, not literally,
Yes. Oh, yeah.
but from the federal level.
Literally.
Okay, but that was for how many days out? How many days
Months.
prior?
Oh, prior?
Yeah, prior.
4 or 5 days prior?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Oh, okay, so in order for that to happen, governor had to declare an emergency, and the state had to ask 4 days out for this team or this group.
And we can pre-deploy assets when there's a good probability that we will have a major disaster.
Okay.
So
We're
then
confusing you.
No, you're not. Here's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And Art was saying, you were at the local level. You were the beneficiary of a lot of this stuff that was coming down. And the broadcast today is about utilizing government resources.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what happens is, I think you're about to say, and I'm probably cutting you off, but those people, those senior officials from Health and Human Services come to the Public Health Department, and they set up shop. They bring their laptops, they bring their cell phones, they bring their emergency operations plans that we already share copies of back and forth with each other, but they come and live with you for a number of days before and help you stage assets in. And we're the emergency management and emergency response family is rather small. There are not that many of us. So we all know each other. I mean, I know Michelle Jones, who's here in Alabama. I know Karen. I know across the South, the ones that are in the different states. We know each other, and we can pick up the phone and call and ask for things. Florida, Ray Runa is another good one to call. because they respond to hurricanes all the time. He knows exactly what he's got. We know what he has, and by the way, we're cooperating. Every month we meet and go over how to standardize in the Southeast. We'll talk more about that later, but the Southeast is basically leading the way in standardization of deployable assets that we could use to help each other through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, the EMAC, that we'll talk about more later. But you request the federal team, they come in and they start, for instance, they know that they have federal medical stations, FMSs. And McCarran can talk more about what a federal medical station is, but we were the beneficiary of 2 of them in Mississippi, 500 beds apiece, I think, that were located in Meridian, Mississippi, so that we could evacuate people who needed care but weren't sick enough to go to a hospital. They were maybe homebound patients or something. They go to the federal medical station. We had things like other states that brought in medical teams with basically field hospitals. We use field hospitals from the United States Air Force, the U.S. Army. We had a German field hospital come from Germany and come to the state of Mississippi. We had the Air Guard through Major General Cross and the Army Guard through General Pilot, and then General Honoré, Lieutenant General Honoré, the first Army commander, brought air evacuation assets, brought fixed and rotor wing assets, brought to do medical evacuations with, to be air ambulances because you had no bridges left. They're all torn up.
This all happened, though, because of the collaboration between state and the federal. I mean, I guess what is going through my mind now is if you're fortunate enough that the situation allows some pre-stage, I mean, obviously that's good, the pre-staging, but Karen, maybe this rolls into the national response plan. You know, we were talking about the need to be specific in what you want and need, but then it also sounds like that if you're specific in requesting this kind of team, at that point they're then helping you determine what your specific needs are, and at that point there already is a connection between the local, state, and federal. I mean, when that team comes, okay. So how does this though roll into the NRP, or is it not?
Basically, the NRP, or National Response Plan, is the mechanism by which all the federal agencies coordinate. And it's a basic framework outlining how the assets get on the ground.
Is it it's federal only? I mean, it's specific to the federal assets and how they're going from the federal level to
point A to point B.
Okay, so the NRP is what drives the deployment of the team that...
The National Response Plan, if you'll think about it, remember we talked about having the normal peacetime agencies of government doing what they normally do. You know, the rural development folks give loans to farmers. The Department of Agriculture looks at cows and horses and, all. But in an emergency, the National Response Plan assigns those agencies by prearrangement. I mean, that's what the plan is. It's a plan that's sprung into action when the emergency happens. So it assigns other things for those agencies to do. For instance, you wouldn't think about it perhaps, but the United States Armed Forces, Department of Defense, has huge pharmaceutical stockpiles. Well, during Katrina, I mean, we lost pharmacies, we lost hospitals, we lost, drugstores that had their drugs were waterlogged. You had people with a month's supply of medication who suddenly, had no medication. It's washed away. It's wet. So these requests went out, and the Department of Defense brought pharmaceuticals to bear, from one of their warehouses. So it gives agencies of government that you would not think of having those assets. They've already sat down at the table and they laid their cards out and said, in an emergency, we can bring this to bear. And that plan tells that agency, expect to be called on to do this. And the states, by the way, because of the Stafford Act and the other federal acts, have to have a comprehensive
That's what I was.
plan.
I mean, this is essentially an incident command structure,
Yes.
like at the federal level.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's not the right acronym.
Well,
Maybe
it
the
goes
right term.
back. It goes back to the act that created Department of Homeland Security. That was a major act passed in 2001, 2002.
Right.
And that act said that we need to standardize all of this stuff. We've got federal agencies that are going in directions that aren't all the same direction. States not necessarily going. We need to get all on the same page. So the act says two things really. It says that every federal agency will write a disaster plan, and they will then cooperate into the master plan to make sure that the federal agency plans are all consistent with the federal master plan. And all states have to write an emergency operation plan that is consistent with the plan. And then it even gets down into licensed facilities like hospitals and that sort of stuff. They are supposed to have plans that also are consistent. So the idea is we've got a big master plan for how we're going to handle a disaster. Federal agencies need to be on that track, state agencies, and even licensed facilities, all on that track. So designed to meet the emergency so that we're not, pointing directions and when we're there. We all know where we're going. That's what, and this has all begun since 2001, really.
And so, I mean, that is how the state and the federal level interact in a way that is consistent. I mean, the National Response Plan and the Stafford Act sort of said we all got to get on the same page. We need to use the same language so that in the case of emergency, the same way you had talked about, we're circling the wagons at the state level, so is the federal government, and they're circling their wagons. Yeah. They may be different wagons, but everybody's essentially circling in order to deal with this.
Yes.
Oh.
And HHS is the lead agency for ESF 8, which is the public health and medical response. And there are various support agencies, VA, DOD, and I'm not sure.
Well, hey, okay.
Pick three letters.
Yeah. I've got my acronym cheat sheet right over here. But I'll stop you there. Back me up again. ESF 8. We talked. Where does that fit in? I mean, you described what it is, and I know that there are a number of ESFs. Where are they, and in this grand scheme of things?
ESF 8 is basically the mechanism by which public health and medical assets are provided to the states and the locals through the state.
And each state, like the Alabama Department of Public Health and the Mississippi Department of Health, have, as assigned by their governor through their emergency management plans, are assigned to do things. The same thing like we do in Mississippi. The Public Health Department is the lead agency for, the coordinating agency, if you will, for ESF 8. And there are other support agencies that, like our Department of Mental Health is a support agency because they have facilities, they have nurses, they have physicians, and we, in fact, utilize some of their bed space to evacuate other patients into in a time of crisis. The licensure boards in all the states, like your licensure board for nurses, licensure board for physicians, licensure board for optometrists, for physical therapists, I mean, whatever medical asset or medical personnel you can think of that are licensed, they fall in with as a support agency for the coordinating agency, that's the Public Health Department. And each of those is expected to bring something to the table. They bring their capability to license professionals in an emergency and validate their credentials in terms of the licensing agencies. And there are other things like, for instance, our Department of Human Services is mainly responsible for what we call ESF 6, mass care. They and the American Red Cross do that. Well, we took over last year in Mississippi as part of ESF 8 the management of medical special needs shelters, if you will, and we're going to continue to do that. So we need social workers. We need people to keep track of who's there. We need people to help arrange meals and comfort items to keep track of family members. So other state agencies and other public service non-governmental agencies are tasked to come help us do that. And basically the plan just lays out, this emergency management plan parrots or copies the functions at the federal level,
Right.
and assigns them to state agencies to do the things that we're capable of doing. And similarly, the counties and cities have an emergency management plan that do the same thing, and they have the same ESFs, and they assign them out to their public works department, to their police department, to their fire department.
So if I had a grease board here,
Yeah.
ESF, it could be any one of the ESFs, but the ESF 8, let's play with this, happens all the way down to the county level, or starts, if you will, starts at,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and rolls itself up into the state.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, okay. And then there's where the next jump is. Then though, rolls itself up. I mean, essentially the same way there is a director of ESF 8 for Mississippi at the state level, there is his or her counterpart at the federal.
Right.
But there's a regional level in between, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the regional level is basically coordinated through FEMA.
So let's walk through that piece then one more time. All right. So I'm at the county level and I need something. I'm in the ESF is part of emergency management.
You need some cots for a
I
shelter.
need some stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't have enough.
Right.
So I go to then my state level.
Your emergency manager for your county is the gatekeeper, or for your city perhaps, but usually the county is the gatekeeper for all this stuff. And we, in order to avoid the Tower of Babel-like confusion we would have if every homeowner were calling us needing supplies and cots,
Right.
it's all channeled through that county emergency manager. And they have under them an emergency management operations center, an EOC, emergency operations center, that they activate with a representative from all the ESFs. For number one, for transportation, it might be that there's a MARTA, Atlanta has a MARTA, their mass transit authority. For Jackson, Mississippi, it might be something else for the transportation. For public safety, they're going to have their police instead of the highway patrol. But there'll be a representative from every agency. They previously assigned, their board of supervisors or county commissioners or the mayor of the city have already assigned through their plan certain functions to those county arms of county or city government. And those people man those desks, and they decide the ESF8 guy may be the administrator of the local hospital. Or a nurse from the emergency room in a local hospital, or some other local function that knows something about the medical system in that county and the medical services that are provided in that county and the medical assets that are in that county. So he or she then says, oh, you need 100 cots for a shelter? Okay, well, we only have 50. I'll give you the 50 I've got. Let me call the state. It validates the request with the county emergency manager, and then they run it right up either on a computer or call the state desk, and they talk to the state ESF8 coordinator in the emergency management agency. Okay, then it runs on up. Well, I've got them, or I don't have them.
Well, so let's say it does. Yeah, I don't have enough. ESF8 picks up the phone at the state level, and now we're rolling up and we're hitting your group. And we've got what? Phone call, email?
We have David Traynor on the phone
Oh.
to join us.
Hey, good.
David, you can go ahead.
Sorry for my tardiness. I'm in Orlando, and I can't read the clocks down here. So
Take those silly ears off, David.
Yes, sir. Yes, I will. But I figured John Weibel could definitely cover for me quite effectively. But everything I've heard thus far is absolutely 100% accurate. That's exactly how our system works. The train is driven by the locals. And the state and federal government only steps in when it exceeds the capability of local, county, government to respond to whatever that emergency is, and then we just simply supply it to the extent that we have it, and then we take it to the federal government and facilitate it. And all this is done computerized. We have a computerized network database that we communicate between the county, state, and also the federal government.
Sounds like you're enjoying yourself in Orlando.
Oh, just tons of fun.
I'm sorry. Listen, are you going to be able to hang on with us for a little bit?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let's do this. I want to take a short break because when we come back, I'm going to take just a 2-minute break. I want to talk a little bit about how this doesn't work. I mean, we're talking about how it's in place and it's smooth, and there's all these, all my questions seem to be answered, and it should work really well. But as we all want to know, and we've seen, sometimes it doesn't work. Let's talk a little bit about how it goes wrong or how it could go wrong, and what we need to do to remedy it.
Or just how much time you have to wait before you're going to get it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think.
Eventually. Hopefully sooner as opposed to later.
Okay, well, soon as we're going to take a quick break, this is also a great time to send in your emails or your phone calls. Call in, email in. We're going to take 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Before we get going, I realized that I did not introduce David Tranter, and David, can you hear us? I can hear him. Let me introduce Okay, let me introduce David to everybody. And John, you can fill in what I don't. David is the Assistant Attorney General, and he's also the General Counsel for the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is there anything else you want to fill in?
Just don't eat right now, David.
No.
Okay, let's get back to there. I've had a lot of questions, and everything seems to flow. We recognize that there's a lot of documents with a lot of words, but I think all of you have pointed out in a really nice way that while it's complex, it is designed to work in a way that is not overwhelming and not overly complicated in terms of its functions. How can it go wrong? How can it not work? I mean, we were talking before we started this broadcast about sort of things that you need to do or things that you fail to do that make the system not work.
One thing is at the local level or even at the state level, I need a doctor. Oh, really? What kind of doctor you need? I'll just ship you any doctor. You may get a guy from the FDA who hasn't practiced medicine in 20 years, and you need somebody to go in and do an emergency room. So it's very... We talk about asking with great specificity what you need. You got to ask. You need to ask with specificity. Otherwise, you're not going to get what you want.
But again, same thing upstream. Now you say you, meaning you at the county level, needs to be specific to the state, who needs to be specific to you all.
Yeah.
Correct.
And well, what if you don't or can't, or again, we talk about it's one thing we see the emergency coming. We see the hurricane coming. We've got a little bit of time. Earthquake. What happens if we're in a situation where we don't know exactly what we need? How is the system designed to deal with that a little bit? Or is that by definition mean you're going to have problems getting what you want?
You're always going to have problems getting what you want, when you want it, or when you need it. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. If you imagine the federal government as an aircraft carrier, it takes 35 miles for an aircraft carrier to make a circle. Okay, in the open water, you got to turn that thing around at full speed. It's a 35-mile turning radius. It's not going to happen instantly. It's not going to happen if you need a field hospital here now. You better have one you pull out of your pocket, because it will take 72 to 96 hours to get a federal asset on the ground, and that's if everything's working right. It's just, if you'll recall, you've seen public service announcements. You've heard public service announcements where people tell you
3 days.
Yeah, have 3 days worth of
Right.
food and water. You need to have more than that. But the 3 days of food and water and provisions, medication, whatever in your home to shelter in place is an absolute minimum, because it's going to take that long to get the county government the state government and the federal government giving you what you need. For instance, I'll give you a good example. When Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, normally in a disaster, and you guys have been around for years, John, you know how it is, and Karen, you have, say it hits the Gulf Coast, well, 20 or 30 miles up the coast, you get out of Mobile County, you get out of Baldwin County, and things are torn up, but they're kind of back to normal. I mean, things work. You can turn on the lights and you get lights, maybe not that day, but the next day. You can go to a gas station, you get gasoline. When Katrina hit, Jackson's about 160 miles from the Gulf Coast. 90 miles north of Jackson, 250 miles away, had no electricity, had no gasoline. Food going bad in grocery stores. No ice. You couldn't make ice to keep stuff refrigerated. So just to get the basics of life, the things you got to have, took an inordinate amount of time, and for as you pointed out, there was a tremendous number of square miles that were affected. Even in the smallest of disasters, it takes 3 days to get something from state government or the federal government to the local level, because the request has to be carried up the chain, even though it be electronically. It has to be given to the proper agency. That person has to then find where that asset is and turn it on, get the personnel there to deliver it, and get it through those miles of torn up roads and trees down and everything else. It takes an enormous amount of time. You never can plan to have, you never can have enough provisions at the local level. You never can have enough assets stored locally, because you're going to use them.
Do you think that states have the wrong perception? I mean, we heard of this, Katrina is what sort of brought this all out. From the federal perspective, are states not thinking about this correctly in this idea of how to expect or to really utilize government resources? I mean, or is that just a sort of misperception that we saw in the media, that there's these expectations it'll be here, and it was told that it was going to be here, then it wasn't here? Is that something that was just playing out in the media, or do you think that states don't have the right perception about how to access or what to expect, more importantly?
I think it's more a perception on how long it will take to get the assets deployed, and that goes back to the specificity of the request. If you ask for a doctor may come, but it's not the doctor that you need, and the more specific you can be in a request, the faster we can fill that request. We do not want a state to fail because we didn't get assets on the ground soon enough.
And the other part of what she's talking about is, if states and the federal government and counties participate in what's called asset or resource typing. Typing, you think about blood typing. Mm-hmm. You're in a wreck, you need some blood. You just want any blood? No. You want the blood type that matches your blood type, or you're going to die. Not from the wreck, but from the reaction to the bad blood, okay, the blood that didn't fit your blood type. So asset typing is kind of like that. May not be quite as serious, but if you think about it, if you can plan ahead of time and say, I have a team, an epidemiology team, I have a public health team that does entomology, insects, okay? I have a public health team that helps water systems recover. I have a public health team that does whatever. If we can all agree that if I call for this team, if I need this team, I get this many people equipped this way, then we will have been successful, because I know when I request a type 1 or a type 4 epidemiology team, I get 5 CDC trained epidemiologists, and I get field equipment, and I get some stuff. They come equipped with provisions for 96 hours, and they come with transportation, and they come with their satellite phones and the equipment they need to diagnose disease on the ground. Mm-hmm. If we can all agree on that, ahead of time, which is what we're doing. I mean, it's slow to come to public health. It's not that we haven't been trying it. It's just that this whole idea of asset typing and incident command started with another arm of government, with the fire service, and it's taken hold after the anthrax attacks and 9/11 and et cetera. We're doing better at it, and we're getting assets typed.
We got an email. We have an email? Do we? My little screens here had big flashing email.
I saw it too.
Email. Okay, maybe we don't have an email.
No, what we have is a power surge.
Exactly.
That would do it.
Yeah.
You made, I think, a really important point that, again, I think the public, maybe we may have the wrong perception of this. There's this difference between it's not working or the system's too complicated, it doesn't work, versus I think what Art's saying is it's slowly coming into play in a way that it needs to.
I think we have, if you turn on your TV now, the picture's on instantly. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, when we were kids, you turn the TV on, it took 2 or 3 minutes to warm up. The tubes had to get warm and all that stuff. But we get it instantly now. Years ago, if you wanted oatmeal, what'd you do? You got some oatmeal out and you put it in there and you heated it up, and it took about 15, 20 minutes to make your oatmeal. Now you tear a little packet open and put it in the microwave and put some water in there, and in a minute and 30 seconds, you got some hot oatmeal. We're an instant society. We expect things to be there for us in an instant. The genie's there. You know, all I got to do is open the bottle. And with something this massive that requires this much coordination and this much time and space, I mean, you still have the normal constraints on time and space. I can't get something from Idaho here. If I request it today, it's got to get it here on the road or be flown here, and it's not going to be here tonight.
We now have an email, right?
Yes, we have a viewer who's a behavioral health planner for a HRSA region in Oregon. And she writes that a major concern is the procurement of behavioral health medications in a disaster, and the SNS does not carry these types of medications. So what kind of systems are in place to help people procure these kind of medications?
Well, we have just recently developed a mental health team, and there are 26 members per team, and they're on call every 5 months. So hopefully they'll have the medications that they need with them.
Well, HHS has developed a federal team.
Yes.
But, okay, and then I'll play the same stupid question
Devil's
I keep
advocate.
asking. No, just same question. Okay, how does she get them and the resources? How does it go from HHS level down to what she's going to need in an emergency? Tell me.
Yeah.
'Cause it's a new team.
Yes, and they're on 36-hour recall, so it would take 3 days for them to get there, but hopefully they would get there with the medications that they would require.
But the mechanism would be the same mechanism.
Yeah,
that
same
we've been
mechanism,
talking about.
ARF through mission assignment.
Well, what we have here is a new resource that responds to a need that maybe we didn't know we had, and this is a situation that we had here in Alabama as a result of Katrina, and I'm sure you had it in the other states.
Absolutely.
But the states that received lots of evacuees, we had people come and they're prepared to be evacuated and stay somewhere for 3 days or a week or something. Well, after a while, this is getting really, really old, and we learned that we did not have this mental health component. That was a real need that we had, was supplying mental health needs, and we were deficient in that.
I will tell you that after we've always had a very good working relationship in Mississippi with our Department of Mental Health. They've done an outstanding job.
Fabulous.
With working with us as far as emergency response, but they're working with us to do an even better job, and they are developing, as the federal component, Karen talked about it, we're developing a state component that's going to deliver mental health services in a disaster. And it'll consist of both public and private sector mental health professionals, and also we're working to establish some deployable pharmaceutical assets, if you will.
So it's
that
the
will-
state equivalent of this.
And
Yeah.
remember, it's you. I can get it there maybe in 24 to 48 hours.
Right.
After something happens, and where Karen's may take another couple of days behind that. So my guys and girls would be the first to go in and help beyond the local level, as local resources are inadequate or overwhelmed, and then we would be able to stay there for several days until Karen's teams could come in and help augment us, and we could rotate some of our personnel out.
How does, I sort of two questions on that. One, how is it communicated when HHS develops a new team? How does the states know about that is a new asset? I mean, there's so many potential assets. How do they know about it? Now, number one, and then number two, you talked about at sort of in the NRP that there's all these layers of sort of mimicking that if that they've got a mental health at the HHS level now. The state has it. Is that a requirement that when new assets are sort of being rolled out, or it just makes the process easier?
It's just really good common sense. And what I would hate to see is that the county resources are depleted, and I had no state level resources for them to request, or for us to throw against the problem for the first few days until we could receive, if the disaster is severe enough, help from Health and Human Services.
How do we find out, though, about new teams like this at the state level?
I think HHS has been very proactive in describing the teams that have been newly developed. And we have a variety of teams, which I'll go through in a minute.
Well, yeah, and I know you've got a couple slides on this.
Yep.
And let's talk about that, but just real quickly before. I mean, you're here. We sort of talk about the federal level. We talk about the state level, but there's this regional piece that's you. And I mean, help us understand kind of where you fit in, and then obviously go on and talk about the teams. But where are you in this whole process?
I try to sit next to the operations chief for ESF 8. That way I can describe the necessary assets as soon as they come to my attention. So I was with Art in the forward command post in Gulfport, and I try to make sure that I deployed to Tropical Storm Ernesto, and I was with Ray Runo, who Art has already described, and basically I sit next to the ops chief, so I know the assets that are required as soon as they know.
Do you have a team? I mean, what if multiple you're the regional director or coordinator, so what happens if multiple states are calling in? Does the region deploy a team?
Yes.
Okay, so there's
to each state.
That's what. So you're going to one, and your counterpart is going to another.
Yes.
Okay. Wait, before you go, we have a follow-up email about the mental health question.
Well, I think you may have asked it, but she's just asking how does she find out about these new federal asset teams, such as a mental health team.
Okay.
So, would it go? It goes from HHS to the state level. Mm-hmm. The information gets down, and then again, as I think we've talked about, if you're at the county level and you're not an EMA person, but you want to know about this, go to your EMA. Is that correct in thinking? Because there's a lot. There's so many folks. I mean, public health is so big. There's so many folks out there that are not going to know about this.
It's like the other day, and I'm not going to name the person nor the location, but I had one of my emergency response coordinators call me about a local entity that wanted a plan built, an emergency plan, and but they didn't want to deal with the local emergency manager. And I said, well, we can't help them. That's easy. I mean, we do not cut. The local EMA is the person that should be in the loop for every decision. They may not make the decision. They may not like the decision you made, but you can't leave them blindsided. You can't plan in a vacuum. So all this, I would say, if you have questions about any of the things we've talked about, the best place to start, just like Karen said, just like John said, is your local emergency management folks, your local emergency manager. That's the best place.
What didn't work in Mississippi with this system?
What didn't work?
Yeah,
I have a hard time figuring out what didn't work because really, I mean, our experience, we had so many good things happen with Alabama, Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, I mean, New York, California, even foreign countries sending aid, giving us aid, and then the federal government response was just outstanding. Now, we had no complaints about any of it. What may not have worked as well was our coordinating it all. There was so great a need all of a sudden, and so much coming in that some places may have gotten an unequal distribution of resources. I mean, that's probably my fault more than anything else, or more than anyone else's. Was we just had so much coming in and so much need. Our function was to match up the need with the resource, and sometimes I just didn't do such a good job of that.
Was that the perception from HHS too, as far as the Mississippi response, that it went as good as would have been expected given the circumstances?
Absolutely.
I mean, we're all adults around the table here, and except for you, all lawyers. So we get pretty sharp tongued, and if something went wrong, I'd tell them. With Karen sitting here, I'd say, look, we didn't do this right, we didn't do that right. But we were very satisfied with our federal response, with the response from our sister states through the EMAC process, and volunteers. You know, God love them. There were a lot of people that just drove down just to help for the weekend, and you're glad to see them. Now later on, you have to kind of worry about bringing your local systems back up. The medical system is a living, breathing apparatus in a county. It's got doctors and nurses and ancillary personnel and office staff and resources, stuff, you know, hospitals and ambulances and things. And as those people and those resources and assets come back into being or reborn after a storm, either by the people, you know, reopening an office or reacquiring a CAT scanner or whatever, you have to start at some point deciding that I'm going to support the locals again, and maybe not. We don't need as many volunteers as we once had. And people think about it. We talked about it before. You know, you grow up. We have, of course, being an agrarian society down here, we grow up, people go to barn raisins, and, you know, the community gets together and harvests hay and crops for each other, and you have a piece of machinery I need, and I have a piece of machinery you need, and we share it. People in the South are a very giving society, and we had an overwhelming number of volunteers, and not just from the South, from everywhere. Americans are very generous people. But at some point in time, I have to start paying again for the physician who lives in my community to practice medicine, or he's going to go somewhere else to put bread on his table. And we face that situation all across South Mississippi, where the dentists and doctors were out of business for months. And when they could come back, you know, if you still have a guy over here giving free medical care on the street corner, it may not be not because he's not a good medical practitioner, but he's giving care on the street corner, as opposed to a modern medical office with laboratory and microscopes and diagnostic instruments and medications that are available to him. So,
is that a volunteer effort? I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like it's deciding when the assets need to go back home.
And
exactly.
It's a low. Remember,
but is that some sort of joint decision?
Yes,
it is. And we had the local ESF8 folks the state ESF 8 folks and the federal ESF 8 folks drafted together what we call the Mississippi Post-Katrina Transition Plan. And it basically laid out the framework. Remember, the locals we had to have all this stuff. We called for it. The local people asked for it. And then either the state or the federal government supplied it, or volunteers supplied it. All of a sudden, as the economy comes back, as the medical services come back to a community, we don't need as much of the volunteer stuff anymore. We don't need as much federal and state support as we had. So this transition plan was detailing, in a way, how the local community saw itself coming back online, its systems, its medical apparatus coming back online. And then we just took it and pretty much laid out for the next year or two how the state and federal assets withdraw from the community and the community cranks back up its own organic assets.
Where is that? Was that a decision of Mississippi? Is that outlined in the NRP? Was that something that was unique to Mississippi?
It was unique to Mississippi as far as I know.
And you got to remember, this is the big one. I mean, we've had the New Madrid fault earthquakes that made the Mississippi River run backwards, but we didn't have skyscrapers and 3 million people in a small southern state. We had maybe 100,000 Native Americans here, or 10,000 Native Americans here, and no big structures and no cars and all that. So this was the biggest thing we hope we'll ever see in our lifetime, and the biggest thing we've seen thus far. So you had to have some way to pull things back out in an organized fashion.
What do we have?
We have a viewer that writes, we should have at least 3 days of supplies before the federals come in. Why does it take so long to respond, and what should we stockpile at the local level?
Well, remember, again, my analogy about turning the aircraft carrier around, the federal government is a huge thing, and the assets that we need here on the ground in South Alabama or South Mississippi for a hurricane may be in Maine or Washington State or California. And it takes an extraordinary amount of time to get those air crews alerted, get the airplane serviced out, and get them and their ground support crews flown here. If it's an aircraft, if it's something on the ground, gosh, I've never driven to Washington State, but I bet it takes a long time to drive from there down here.
Well, and that's assuming that on the state's level, you've done all your paperwork, you've done your part as fast as you can.
Right.
And say it again, read the email one more time.
He asks, why does it take so long to respond, and what should we stockpile at the local level?
Everything you need. Yes? Everything you think you may need?
I guess, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that one, and I'm not trying to stall or not answer it. And it's just, your plan needs to be an all hazards plan. You shouldn't plan for an earthquake. You shouldn't plan for a tsunami. You shouldn't plan for an ice storm. You shouldn't plan for pandemic influenza. You should get the basic items that you can afford in your household: food, water, medications, disinfection supplies, gasoline, what you can afford. And people say, well, I can't afford to do that. Well, I've been, college students are the poorest folks on earth, I think. And we've all been college students here in the room here. And I could afford an extra can of tuna a week to put back in case my money ran out, or an extra can of sauerkraut and some beanie weenies or something. I couldn't buy a lot, but I could afford to put up a little bit. So as I could afford to do so, I stockpiled and squirreled away some stuff. And so I would say determine what you can comfortably do without impacting your current financial situation. And if it's putting 6 months worth of food up, like some people do, then put 6 months worth of food up. If I can put up some food and some water and some medications and flashlight batteries and a radio for a 3 or 4 or 5 day stay in my own home without external help, then I would say you do that. And there are excellent resources online. I know the Mississippi Department of Health and probably the Alabama Department of Health, the public health preparedness sections on their websites have a list of supplies. Your local emergency manager has them. Red Cross has them. HHS has them. You can go to any of those websites and find a very good basic planning document to give you some guidance about what you ought to have in your own personal food kit, emergency kit, go kit.
And for your business
right,
as well.
and exactly. And I got asked to give a talk several months ago about business preparedness, because if your business isn't prepared, or if you God forbid can't make it home, then your business needs to be able to care for you right there. What if we have a chemical release, not an attack, but we have all kinds of trains running through here.
Chlorine spill.
Yeah, a chlorine spill.
Yeah.
And you have to shelter in place at your business for a couple of days until it's cleaned up. Well, do you have food and water for 50 people that work for you or 100 people that work for you? And the odds are, you probably don't.
Well, and this, this is coming from the state level and now the federal level. It gets back to this idea, I think sometimes a misperception of the general public, that I need to care for myself even though I've got all these things in place at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level. The bottom line is you as an individual are going to have to do this, and your city, county, state, and federal EMA and are there to support you in it, but there's nothing that's going to turn that aircraft around any faster than it is. Well, I got to speculate, and if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to. And we talked about sort of the blame game, and I've been trying not to go here, but can any of you comment on what happened differently in New Orleans than in Mississippi, or was it the event itself was different? Because you can't get away from the contrast.
It's probably a little bit of both, and I'm not a Louisianan, and I didn't have a whole lot. I had my hands full. The Bible talks about how can you see to remove the splinter from my eye when you hadn't taken the stick out of your eye. Well, I was busy getting the stick out of my eye about that time and didn't really have a lot to say about what was happening in Louisiana. But it seems to me that again, I know Mississippi. I know Mississippians. It is largely, although people will disagree in the middle of Jackson perhaps, or a couple of the larger places. It's an agrarian society. It's a rural society. People are used to being self-sufficient. People are used to having to travel 10 or 15 miles into town to get gasoline, and you can't walk down to the corner store and get a loaf of bread. You got a plan. You may only go to the store once every week or once a month, so you got to have weeks or months worth of food. A lot of folks had gasoline. A lot of folks had chainsaws. And you walk down the street in New Orleans, and I bet you not very many people had gasoline stockpiled, even though you couldn't, after Katrina, you couldn't get gasoline for 200 miles. I bet you very few people had a chainsaw. I bet you very few people had stuff that, like a four-wheeler, that a lot of people in the country have in Mississippi. A lot of people in town have four-wheelers. But it's not, I don't think it's a difference in people. It wasn't that people in New Orleans just bellyache and they didn't have anything except to gripe. I just don't think the assets were there, because in Mississippi you have to have them to live. You have to have that week's worth of groceries. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because I can't take a trip into town every day 15, 20 miles to get a loaf of bread and forget the milk and go back later that afternoon. So it's a different mindset, and I just think people didn't stockpile because it's so easy to walk next door or down the street to the local grocer and get something.
So at the individual level, again, there's all kinds of things that went into it, but at the individual level, there wasn't that level of preparedness, or there may not have been that level of preparedness.
I'm just guessing.
Either of you want to comment on that? Because again, we see the contrast. Whether it's played out in the media, etc. Does that sound consistent? Because
probably.
From the federal perspective, from your perspective.
I'm not speaking from the federal perspective.
From your perspective,
yes.
In your,
like Art said, the Mississippians help each other, and to probably the extent of their own livelihood, and I don't know that that was the case in New Orleans.
Certainly. Well, let me
ahead.
say,
Go ahead.
but
Shoot.
I'm just going to say, I won't really comment on response because I was here in Alabama, but certainly you had the exacerbating factor in New Orleans of the levees breaking.
Absolutely.
In Mississippi, the storm came, it did terrible damage, then the waters receded. In Mississippi, I mean, in New Orleans,
It was too wet to work for weeks, wasn't it?
Weeks.
Yeah.
The water would still be there if they hadn't got in and pumped it out. And that's something that that's an unusual circumstance. I don't know another city in the country that would be contemplating that type of thing. I don't know another city that's below sea level.
Not of that size.
Not of that
anyway.
size.
Well, and then that's the difference, and we've talked about this before. Sometimes plans, even the best plans, are overwhelmed by the situation, and we start talking about was the response or how did they do given the situation, and the situation may have been somewhat different. And again, I throw the question out only because when we do talk to the folks from Mississippi, we do hear. I know that in the broadcast that I've done, I hear this general sort of, we had the plan in place, it was overwhelming, but the plan worked to the best of its abilities given the situation. I've heard that from Jim Craig, and I'm hearing the same thing. We're running out of time, and I always want to leave folks with something that they can sort of walk away from and say, okay, I understand now. I understand what to do or how to do. I mean, each of you just take a shot at, what's the take-home message? What do you want folks out there to know when it comes to utilizing government resources, or broader, the relationship between the federal government and the individual?
I'd say number one is have your own resources in place.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's no amount of local, county, state, or federal assets are going to get to you quicker than you can reach in your own pantry, reach in your own tool shed, reach in your own automobile, and get something for you and your family. It's not going to get there as quickly as you need it. With the best of intentions, the best greased, the best plan, it's with everybody, all people of goodwill, assuming that nothing goes wrong, it's still going to be hours, days before your help you need gets there.
Well, Karen, what about a take-home message from a sort of utilizing government resources, not using? What should folks know when it comes to not just be prepared yourself, but what can they do or know to best utilize the resources?
Basically, just be aware of the process for requesting federal assets, and we've gone through this, the ARF emission assignment process, and the more specific you can be in requesting any asset, the faster we can provide that asset to you.
Okay. John?
Realize that the local EMA is the coordinator. That's really what you need to know is if I need something, if I'm a local manager, I need something, go to my local EMA. If they don't have it, they know who to ask. And if the people they ask don't have it, then they know who to ask. So you can, that's the three letters that you need to take away from here, I would think, is EMA.
That's a good
Call
point.
your local EMA. And also, if you're expecting to get reimbursed for all of this, make sure you got your records, because all of these payments under Stafford Act, they're grants. And so lots of the federal grant requirements that obtain in all the different grants that we apply for also obtain for the individual aid, for aids to nonprofits, aids to government. You need to know what's eligible,
right.
What's not eligible, and if you can't document it, it's like I say, the golden rule of documentation is if it ain't wrote down, it didn't happen. And corollary, the way it is wrote down is the way it happened, regardless of the way it happened.
And I'll give you we talked about this again before the show and didn't have a lot of time to talk about it, but we had self-deployed assets come from other states that were depending on and intent on getting federal reimbursement for those assets. They did not go through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact process where a state requests it, a state says, here's what I've got it for, and here's what I can pay for it, here's what I expect payment for, and then the requesting state says, okay, I agree to that, send them. If you don't follow that format, guess what? Then that obligation to pay for that asset that was brought to your state is not there. And we had people bring, expensive assets like helicopters and, all kinds of stuff, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then wanted to get paid for it. And as John says, the documentation wasn't there. It didn't happen. It's an expensive lesson.
We can go on and on and on and on. We got to end.
Yes, sir.
And so I appreciate everybody sharing their information, knowledge, conceptualizations, and sort of tying this thing in. I hope you all got as much out of this as I did. I think just one comment, what I took away from this, we're all in it together. And there are plans in place, and they may not work as quickly as we want, but what I'm hearing, what I heard from all of you today is that if we as individuals can be ready ourselves and prepared and know who to go to at the local level, the next step up from us as individuals, then that allows the plan that's in place to work better. It may not work perfectly, but it may work better. So again, thank you everybody. Before we end today, I want to talk to you a little bit about some educational programs that are going to be planned over the next several months, a couple of them. First, join us on Friday, October 20th, for a program that's going to address conflict and collaboration competencies in public health. And then also on Tuesday, November 28th, we're going to discuss WMD, disaster planning and operations. Once again, you can get information about those events from the center's website, and the screen is up there. You can go ahead and get that. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you next time.